My own understanding as a political economist is that the business segment of Pakistan is a key element of what I call the system of authoritarian power sharing, right? Um, Entrenched businesses in Pakistan from the very early period have had very strong relations with the country's military establishment. They are not to be blamed. Any businessman would like certainty, they would like commitment. In many poor countries where rule of law is weak, it is difficult to solve what economists would describe as the commitment problem. The biggest problem that an investor faces is that he or she invests large sums of money in an economy, and most of those projects are, run into several years. Some of them are over decades. So you need inter-temporal commitments. You need commitments over time. And the big commitment that an investor or a businessman faces is predictability and stability of the business environment, that their assets, their investments will not be threatened, they will not be expropriated. So typically, they would align with the most stable, with the most sort of powerful institution in any country, right? So if, for example, foreign investors are investing, or even Gulf investors are investing in Egypt, they would go for the Egyptian military. If they're investing in Morocco, they're going to form partnerships with the Moroccan king, right, who also owns a lot of companies, and so on and so forth. So the point that I'm trying to make is that in an environment which lacks political stability, where there is no rule of law, businesses typically align themselves with the most stable element, right, and seek assurances from them. Now, as it happens, a lot of these entrenched businesses in Pakistan have been or have become over time an important part of what I call the system of authoritarian power sharing. What do we mean by that? Typically, in popular press, popular academic jargon, we talk about civil-military relations, as if civil is something different from the military. In many of the countries like Pakistan, autocrats, and I would say this is actually a global phenomenon. There's a lot of work by people like Milan Swanek, Jennifer Gandhi, a whole range of other scholars who've talked about, how autocratic rule survives. And the basic idea in much of this academic scholarly work is that authoritarian rule is not a solo performance. It is joint rule. You need to rule with other groups in society. You need to ensure that they support you. And I think in the Pakistani context, a lot of what we describe as civil have in one way or another partnered with the military regime, given this regime their support, provided it legitimacy, and they have been part of what scholars would call joint rule. This is the system of authoritarian power sharing, with the military and the establishment sitting at the heart of it, but they need allies in judiciary. There's a lot of work on judicial politics, including by my Oxford colleague, whose book on Yasser Qureshi's book on judicial politics has made a lot of waves. So judiciary is important. They have their allies in the bureaucracy, especially the police, a lot of control. They have allies with academics and intellectuals who've given a veneer of legitimacy to the autocratic rulers. They have their allies in think tanks, right? And some of those think tanks are foreign-funded think tanks. They've been allies. They have media has emerged as a big ally. I mean, media has always been, sort of controlled. I mean, if you were looking at the Jung newspaper or other print newspapers in the 80s or in the 60s, they've, press and publication ordinance under Ayub Khan. These were all attempts to control the media. So media is also an important part of the system of authoritarian power sharing. The landed elites, the political elites in particular, are key part. And you've seen this in the clearest term during the PDM government, because a lot of them are so-called democratic parties, but they've practically aligned with the authoritarian power structure. The one who was deposed, Imran Khan's PTI, obviously came with the support of the military as well. But at this instance, it was challenging the military and the other ganged up. So ultimately, a lot of these political parties, I would call them, also not necessarily civil, they're part of this system of authoritarian power sharing. They provide continued support, they give it sustenance, they give it practical legitimacy, so on and so forth. In this milieu, another group that is important for understanding the system of authoritarian power sharing is the business group, because large established businesses have historically been, for the reasons that I described earlier in this podcast, have supported the military. They have direct lines of communication with the military. The problem, however, is that a lot of these businesses seek protection. They are not competitive businesses who are competing in global markets. They're asking for fundamental economic reforms. These businesses, and I'm obviously generalizing a lot because there'll be a lot of exceptions, but these businesses in general are the ones that actually obstruct economic reform. So let me give you a few examples. There was a great book that students and scholars like yourself should study. It's a journalistic piece of work, not a lot of analytical content, but it has data. Who owns Pakistan? This was Shahidul Rahman's book in 1990s. I think it came out in 1997 or 6, probably 98, but late 90s. And he systematically documented all the businesses, the 40 or 42 business families that controlled Pakistan. Many of these business families were allies of Ayub Khan. Many of these.
Sorry.
Okay, no worries, no worries. Many of these business families were also part of Musharraf's and Zia's reform programs. And they benefited from privatization as well. And they control large parts of the economy, largely by erecting entry barriers, by reducing competition through higher trade barriers. And so to give you a very sort of street level example, if you go to some broker in Karachi or another place in the stock market, who are the people who advise? Well, it's Akil Karim Dedis of this world. I hate to take names, but he's a notable actor. Now, if you want to appoint the head of the Securities and Exchange Commission, he will have a veto power on who will be appointed, right? Because his interests got to be protected. If you're talking about sugar barons, they're in all political parties. Sugar is a classic example of this system of authoritarian power sharing, because you have all the major sugar mill owners are, part of different political parties. It doesn't matter whether party X or Y or Z is in power, sugar interests will always be protected. And the military itself owns a sugar mill. There's a Fauji sugar mill. So they are not the lead player, but they're also beneficiaries of this system, right? And what's important in this context to understand, and sugar perhaps is the best example, because sugar is an important part of campaign finance. So as someone who's been a humble student of the sugar market, this didn't really come as a surprise that the ECC approved their exports, provided them subsidies, because this is a form of campaign finance. It's almost like the development spending that is given out to local MPs. So in this system of authoritarian power sharing, economic reform is very difficult, because if there's genuine economic reform, it will upset this system of authoritarian power sharing. If you change the rules of the game through which the sugar market functions, you effectively hurting the establishment's ability for political engineering, because a lot of the same sugar actors who generate and earn rents in the sugar market are important in political engineering. They have planes, they have resources to spend, they recycle it in, right? If you have a genuine sort of land reform, land reform, nobody even talks about these days, so let's forget about that. But at least agricultural income tax, right? Some level of functioning agricultural income tax that removes the distortion of agricultural exemption from the income taxation. That would be problematic, because some of the big landed families have historically been allies of the military. They are part of the system of authoritarian power sharing. So in this system of authoritarian power sharing, if you try and implement structural reform, it gets to the, it is seen as a threat to that system of authority. So a very long-winded answer in the traditional academic mode. I'm a lecturer at the end of the day. So, but I really wanted to give you a holistic perspective on this interaction between the businessman and the army chief. And in that system of authoritarian power sharing, this interaction is important for two reasons. This continued political instability has hurted the investors and businessmen in Karachi. If you speak to them privately, they are panicked and they are asking, what is the military doing? What is their plan? Right? So a key element of the system of authoritarian power sharing, even if not vocally, behind closed doors, is worried, where is the country headed? So in this context, it was not surprising that the military chief had to go and meet with these businessmen and assure them that, look, don't worry, we are on that trajectory.